The story begins when the devil opens a strange new business in Jerry and Morty's neighborhood. His store is called Needful Things, and the concept is simple. The devil gives people objects that appear to be incredibly useful or desirable. The catch is that every item comes with a curse. At first, the business seems almost harmless. People enter the store, find something they desperately want, and walk away believing they've gotten an incredible deal. But Rick immediately becomes suspicious. Rick doesn't believe in free gifts, and he certainly doesn't believe that supernatural powers come without consequences. Meanwhile, Summer becomes fascinated by the store. The devil gives her an enchanted item that allows her to perform incredible things. The problem is that the item slowly reveals its true cost. Rick quickly realizes that the devil isn't simply selling magical objects. He's exploiting people. The devil's entire business depends on temptation. He identifies what people want, gives it to them, and then uses the consequences to control them. For most people, that would be terrifying. For Rick, however, it's basically a business model, and Rick knows how to destroy a business. Rick meets the devil. Eventually, Rick confronts the devil directly. The devil tries to maintain his mysterious and intimidating image, but Rick isn't impressed. That's one of the biggest differences between Rick and almost everyone else in the series. Rick isn't easily intimidated by power. Someone can be a god, an alien, a demon, or an interdimensional being, and Rick will still ask the same question: how does your system work? Once Rick understands the rules, the supernatural mystery disappears. And that's exactly what happens with the devil. Rick realizes that the devil's greatest weapon isn't magic. It's people's willingness to accept a deal without questioning the consequences. So Rick decides to attack the system itself. Rick's first move: Rick begins studying the devil's magical objects. Instead of simply destroying them, he examines how they work. This is important because Rick doesn't want to defeat the devil through brute force. He wants to prove that the devil's entire operation is flawed. Rick starts experimenting with the supernatural technology, and eventually he discovers ways to remove the curses from the devil's products. That completely changes the situation. Suddenly, the devil's biggest selling point disappears. If people can get the benefits without suffering the consequences, why would anyone need the devil? Rick essentially turns the devil's own business model against him. And the devil isn't happy, because this isn't just an attack on his products. It's an attack on his power. The devil underestimates Rick. The devil makes one major mistake. He assumes Rick is simply an arrogant scientist. But Rick is much more dangerous than that. Rick is willing to obsess over a problem until he completely understands it. He doesn't need to believe in magic. He doesn't need to respect supernatural rules. He only needs to find a way to manipulate them. And once Rick figures out how the devil's objects work, the devil's advantage disappears. The devil eventually becomes desperate. His business starts collapsing. Customers stop needing him. His products lose their value. And Rick has effectively beaten the devil without ever becoming his servant. But Rick isn't finished. Not even close. The devil's revenge. After Rick destroys his business, the devil finds another way to hurt him. He begins working with Jerry. This is where the situation becomes even more ridiculous. Jerry is easily impressed by supernatural power, and the devil knows exactly how to manipulate him. The devil eventually gains popularity and becomes successful again. Rick sees this happening and becomes furious. But instead of accepting defeat, Rick starts planning his revenge. And this is where Rick's intelligence becomes genuinely dangerous. Rick realizes that the devil's biggest weakness is his ego. The devil believes he's smarter than everyone around him. He believes humans are easy to manipulate. And most importantly, he believes Rick is simply angry because he lost. But Rick isn't playing emotionally. He's preparing. Rick's ultimate counterattack. Rick eventually challenges the devil in a way that turns the tables completely. Instead of fighting him with magic, Rick uses science, strategy, and sheer determination. The confrontation becomes physical, but it also becomes symbolic. Rick isn't simply fighting a demon. He's proving that even something as ancient and powerful as the devil can be beaten if someone understands the rules better than he does. And Rick doesn't hold back. The fight becomes one of the most memorable moments because the devil expected Rick to be afraid of him. Instead, Rick treats him like another problem that needs solving. Eventually, Rick defeats the devil, but the victory isn't really about strength. It's about refusing to play the game the way the devil wants. The devil's entire power comes from controlling the terms of the deal. Rick simply refuses to accept those terms. Why Rick wins? The deeper meaning behind the story is actually pretty interesting. The devil represents temptation. He offers people exactly what they want, but there's always a hidden price. Rick's advantage is that he doesn't care about the temptation. He cares about understanding the mechanism behind it. That's why the devil can't easily manipulate him. Rick is cynical enough to assume there's always a catch, and that makes him almost impossible to deceive. However, there's another reason Rick wins. Rick is obsessive. Once someone challenges his intelligence, he becomes almost unstoppable. The devil thinks he's dealing with a rebellious human, but he's actually dealing with a man who has spent his entire life breaking the rules of reality. Compare with that, supernatural curses aren't nearly as intimidating. The bigger lesson. The story also fits perfectly with one of the biggest themes of Rick and Morty. The show constantly asks whether intelligence can overcome power. Sometimes the answer is yes. But the show also reminds us that being smarter doesn't necessarily make someone happier or better. Rick can outsmart gods. He can defeat monsters. He can manipulate entire civilizations. But that doesn't solve his personal problems. That's what makes the character so interesting. Rick can beat the devil himself, yet he still struggles with loneliness, depression, family, and his own destructive personality. So when Rick outsmarts the devil, it isn't simply another victory. It's another example of Rick proving that almost nothing in the universe is beyond his ability to challenge. Outro. In the end, Rick doesn't defeat the devil because he's stronger. He defeats him because he refuses to be intimidated. The devil's greatest weapon is temptation. Rick's greatest weapon is curiosity. Once Rick understands how the devil system works, the mystery disappears. And when the mystery disappears, the devil loses his advantage. That's what makes this storyline so entertaining. The devil thought he was dealing with a reckless old scientist, but he was dealing with Rick Sanchez. And when Rick decides that someone has crossed the line, even the devil himself isn't safe. What do you think? But there's an even deeper reason why the devil loses this battle. Rick doesn't just understand the devil's products. He understands the psychology behind the entire operation. The devil's business depends on one simple human weakness. People want something badly enough that they're willing to ignore the consequences. That's why his products work so well. People see what they want, and they stop asking questions. They don't care about the fine print. They don't care about the hidden curse. They just want the reward. Rick, however, is almost the exact opposite. Rick assumes there is always a trap. If someone offers him something for free, his first instinct isn't excitement, it's suspicion. And that makes the devil's entire strategy almost useless against him. The devil can't tempt someone who refuses to play along. This is also why Rick's relationship with Summer becomes important. Summer is fascinated by the supernatural possibilities of the devil's products. She sees the advantages before she sees the danger. Rick sees the opposite. He sees the danger before he even considers the advantages. That difference between them is essentially the difference between curiosity and caution. Summer wants to know what the object can do. Rick wants to know how it does it. And that question changes everything. Once Rick starts experimenting with the devil's products, the supernatural begins to look less like magic and more like a system. And Rick is extremely good at breaking systems. The devil's biggest mistake. The devil's biggest mistake is believing that Rick's anger is based purely on jealousy. He assumes Rick is angry because the devil has created something that Rick can't control. But that's not really what bothers Rick. Rick hates being manipulated. He especially hates people who think they are smarter than him. The devil believes he has discovered a way to exploit humanity. Rick sees that as an intellectual challenge. And once Rick sees something as a challenge, he becomes relentless. This is one of the most dangerous aspects of Rick's personality. He can be lazy. He can be distracted. He can even appear completely uninterested in something. But challenge is intelligence, and suddenly he becomes obsessed. The devil essentially gives Rick a reason to focus. And that turns out to be a terrible decision. Science versus supernatural power. The storyline also creates an interesting contrast between science and supernatural power. Normally, the devil should have the advantage. He has magic. He has knowledge that humans don't understand. He can manipulate supernatural objects. Rick shouldn't even be able to compete. But Rick and Morty constantly flips that expectation. The show suggests that something being supernatural doesn't automatically make it unbeatable. If there are rules, Rick can study those rules. If there are rules, those rules can potentially be exploited. And if those rules can be exploited, Rick can turn the entire system against his creator. That's essentially what happens. Rick doesn't need to become more powerful than the devil. He just needs to understand the devil's power better than the devil expects. And that is a terrifying thought, because it means Rick's real superpower isn't his technology. It's his ability to understand complicated systems incredibly quickly. Why the story fits Rick perfectly. This storyline also captures everything that makes Rick such a fascinating character. He's brilliant, he's arrogant, he's reckless, he's cynical, and he has absolutely no respect for authority. The devil represents one of the ultimate authorities in mythology. He's supposed to be someone humans fear. But Rick looks at him and essentially says, "You're running a business." And that completely destroys the devil's intimidating image. Instead of treating him like an all-powerful supernatural being, Rick treats him like a competitor. That's almost insulting. And eventually, that arrogance becomes part of Rick's advantage. The devil expects fear. Rick gives him contempt. The devil expects obedience. Rick gives him resistance. The devil expects people to accept his deals. Rick starts analyzing the terms and looking for loopholes. That's why their conflict feels so entertaining. It's not simply good versus evil. It's intelligence versus manipulation. Rick's victory comes with a warning. However, there's an ironic side to Rick's victory. Rick proves that he can defeat someone who manipulates people's desires. But Rick himself isn't immune to destructive behavior. In fact, Rick frequently manipulates people around him. He lies to Morty. He uses Jerry. He pushes Summer into dangerous situations. He often believes that because he's smarter than everyone else, he has a right to control the situation. So in a strange way, Rick and the devil aren't complete opposites. They share some of the same qualities. Both understand people's weaknesses. Both manipulate others. Both believe they know better. The difference is that Rick refuses to accept anyone else having control over him. And that's ultimately why he wins. The devil wants people to play by his rules. Rick's entire personality is built around breaking rules. Final takeaway. The most impressive part of Rick's victory isn't that he defeats a supernatural being. It's that he turns the devil's greatest strength into his greatest weakness. The devil believes his power comes from controlling what people want. Rick realizes that control only works when the other person accepts the deal. And Rick never accepts the deal. He questions it. He studies it. He breaks it. Then he uses what he learns to destroy the system that created it. That's classic Rick Sanchez. And it's also one of the clearest examples of why Rick remains one of the most dangerous characters in the entire Rick and Morty universe. Because you can overpower Rick. You can threaten Rick. You can even scare Rick. But if you give Rick enough time to understand how your power works, you're probably already in trouble. And the devil learns that lesson the hard way.